So as mentioned, it's me and Mike today on screen. My background has been mainly in product development. I actually started in impact investing and very quickly moved into the tech side. And I've always focused on product development for over a decade. So that means building and launching technology products across the built environment. And I'm the head of the Mesa team at Sidewalk. I'll share a little bit more about what Mesa is soon, so you'll get to see a slide on that as well. And I'm excited to be joined by Mike. We partner with them on a Mesa installation in, well, Mike can tell you more about everything on that front, and we'll get to it soon. But I'll hand it over to Mike for his intro. He's had a very impressive career that started in engineering and focuses, and I think is quite a leader on sustainability. So Mike, do you want to speak a little bit to how you got to where you are today in terms of your path, and also a little bit more about Hines and Hudson
Absolutely.
Square?
Yeah, always a pleasure to collaborate with Rachel and her team. I feel so cool hanging out with them because who else has one letter email addresses? But
thank you. I feel like I've never really been that's never quite been called out as, so thank you.
Yeah, my background comes more on the applied side or the engineering side of things. Actually, was a computer systems programmer at one time. Got out of that very quickly, went into engineering, realized I wasn't very good at it, and didn't have much control. So moved closer and closer to the owner side. And now with Hines working in the Hudson Square portfolio, but also globally, and how does Hines reduce their carbon footprint and impact on the built environment? And there's been some great things that we've been doing that I'm happy to share a little later on.
Rachel, as many people on the call, I just had to get that out of the way to be told I was on mute. And now that that's over, hopefully it won't happen again. I was going to say, as many people know, Sidewalk Labs is an urban innovation company, and we're part of Alphabet. So we share a lot of the DNA of similar Alphabet companies. Today, we're going to give a quick intro on energy regulation. I'll give a quick explanation on how Mesa and other types of tools can help, especially in affordable ways. We'll go into a fireside chat, and then we'll have an audience Q&A, but feel free to ask questions throughout, and then we'll get to them at the end in the Q&A section. So, Local Law 97. Everyone knows that there's regulation coming. 31 cities and counting in the US have some sort of energy regulation or benchmark. It's important for many reasons. One, it's important that we do our part to be able to change the trajectory of climate change with or without regulation. But with regulation, it creates an additional catalyst because, one, there's fines, and two, it really does quantify the changes that have to be made. So what does this mean? In general, a lot of the buildings that exist now will still exist in the future. So what does that mean for us? It means that we need to focus on a lot of the existing buildings to get them to have better emissions, and energy use, especially where there's low-hanging fruit, and we'll get to that in a bit as well. Most of the emissions, especially in New York City, come from buildings. So 40% nationwide is the emissions contribution from buildings, but in dense cities like New York, that number goes up to 70% or even 73% of emissions from buildings. And so that's where we're focused today. The goal for Local Law 97 is to reduce citywide emissions by 40% by 2030 from a 2005 baseline. So, I mean, all of this is on the screen, but what it in fact, the implications of that are that 60% of buildings, or at least of the building area in cities, will be impacted by this regulation. It means that 26% of carbon has to be cut, which is equal to all of the emissions of San Francisco. And again, there are fines that will be associated with it. So I believe the number is 268 per metric ton that you or your building is over in emissions regulations, in emissions compared to that 2005 baseline. The focus today is mainly on commercial buildings. Of course, this regulation impacts all buildings in New York City. And of course, other cities have regulations as well. We're focused on the New York ones. But as you can see on this chart, based on the actual building count, so building count is in the left, 3% of the building count, or 15% of the square footage in New York City is commercial buildings, yet it accounts for almost 30% of emissions. So there's definitely an outsized proportion from commercial buildings. And you can think about this as well, because in terms of just what you see, there's a lot of wasted energy in commercial buildings. I think everyone's complained or probably seen like offices leading on full blast air conditioning or overcooling spaces, lights on across buildings as you're walking through completely empty buildings in the middle of the night. You know, I think you could see it and feel it, but it's certainly the numbers draw it out. And we did see this. So with COVID, the building, as buildings were completely vacant, energy only went down to 75%. And then with buildings that only had a few people, so very, very small percentage of occupancy, the energy use was back up at 90%. So that means that, to me, that means there's quite a lot of low-hanging fruit in terms of reducing emissions in buildings, but also just being a lot more cost effective. Mike, I'm going to let you explain the next couple charts.
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, it helps to set a little context into how I think about it. We always talk about the punitive legislation and what that means to buildings, but to me, this graph shows the opportunity. If we look at this graph, it identifies all the resource flows within the energy sector and how they get utilized. And in the end, for every unit of energy we put in, we waste 67% of it. So in the end, the reality is you can indicate that as dollars, intellectual capital, energy, whatever it might be. But there's a huge potential to reuse a lot of that wasted energy and put it back into the system for reuse. And I think that's a helpful sort of graph to understand as we talk through this more. You can go to the next slide. One more back. There you go. And then really, we all know we need to get to net zero by 2050. That's a given, but how we get there will determine how much we warm the global temperatures on average throughout the world. And that's a direct correlation to market adoption of these different strategies, whether it's electrification or else. So to me, that shows that we have direct control on the pathway to get to net zero. We all know we need to get to net zero, but that's 20, 30, 40 years away. The reality is we need to act more quickly in order to stem those pathways to limit the global warming to 2 degrees. And on the right, it's really, what's the long-term mindset, right? Who can think 30 years out? I can't, that's for sure. But the reality is there's so much capital, effort, and intellectual capital being provided, and the state has really backed that by solar projects, wind projects, offshore wind, and they've provided a clear outline on what direction they're headed. You can go to the next slide.
Thanks. So within that context, I wanted to share a little bit more about what is Mesa. Mesa is a set of smart devices that's easy install that stops buildings from throwing money out the window, almost literally, in that it ensures that there's both real-time data, but also automated savings, so that the heating and cooling within a space or the outlets within a space are actually turned off or adjusted based on occupancy, based on comfort level of people within that space, and based on weather. So there's a lot of factors that are taken into account when the system adjusts the HVAC or the outlets, but the core of the product is that it's easy install. It feels like an upgrade within the space, and it's affordable by design. So some of the differentiators, as I mentioned, are that yes, it's super easy install. Almost anyone can do it. In fact, my boss's kids, age 4 and 7, did an install themselves. So if you want, you can also hire them to do it. But it's intended to be a great experience for all. So it does have the tenant experience at its core. There's a core element of tenant comfort, but it also makes people feel like the space is being managed and just well taken care of, especially as we return to the office. And again, it's affordable by design. So it's not intended to be a super expensive solution. It's intended to be very easy from the beginning, which both makes it quicker and easier to get up and running, but also easy to keep in the space, maintain, and again, like make people feel like the space is being operated and taken care of, and that the savings happen automatically. So we're going to move into a quick fireside chat, and I'm going to ask Mike a bunch of questions, which I'm always excited about. I always love asking. I always love chatting with him and asking him questions. And please feel free to also add any questions that you might have in the Q&A section. So I'll take most of them at the end, but if there's really good ones, I'll ask them on the spot. Okay.
No
Mike,
pressure.
over to you. So I wanted to get, I guess, give the audience more of a sense of one, how you got here. I think that your charts really help to express that. What's your journey been? And both in the context of how did you end up at Hines, but also in the context of if people wanted to learn from your path, what can they take away?
Yeah. Well, I know we don't have a lot of time, so I won't start at immediate childhood, but I definitely come from an immigrant background where my entire family was born overseas, and just nature, having a large garden, collecting rainwater from rooftops was ingrained in me, and getting yelled at when you didn't shut the lights off, by the way, which is a good plug for Mesa, was ingrained in me from a manual perspective. But then went to engineering school, studied computer science. I think in general, what I've been is a general specialist, I'll call it. So you need to really understand the general point of view in order to connect the dots in the specific fields or specialized fields. So from engineering, went over to the hospital sector, always in the hospital and laboratory sector. Then I came to Hines, and they told me that commercial buildings were complicated. And I started scratching my head. I'm like, you guys serious? Like, what's so complicated about centralized HVAC and a bunch of ductwork? So that's what got me to Hines, and really just pursued a passion. And I think the one bit of advice I would give is being open-minded. And when someone presents a different idea or a very new idea or an outrageous idea, before shooting it down, really, dig deep to figure out if what they're selling or telling is actually true. And that just goes to the context of our global collaboration and really partnering with others, including people like Sidewalk Labs and other industries, to come up with the best solution and maximum uptake into the market.
And can you share a little bit more about the portfolio of buildings that you manage and focus on within Hines? And within that, if you can also share some of the, secrets that you might have that Hines has in addressing Local 197.
Yeah. Our buildings in Hudson Square, obviously Hines is a very big global developer, but in the end, Hudson Square is very much the core of New York City buildings, 1930s, old printing press buildings, very heavy concrete structures, not great super insulated walls. So I feel like it's very indicative of the fabric of New York. And if we can do it there, we can essentially do it anywhere. The secret sauce, I don't know that there's any secret sauce other than hard work and passion, but what I would say is, you have to ask yourself whether you believe in electrification or not. And from my perspective, I 100% believe in it. And you can see the indications that the state and city have made towards that. So it's really, taking the punitive risk and making it an opportunity, and really leveraging all the investment that will be going in to the clean energy sector, as well as the building stock itself. So I'd say, I don't know, that's a secret sauce, but more so than it is a direction.
And then do you have any tips or maybe advice on what other buildings can do in terms of just cutting emissions in general, related to local
Yeah.
law 97, not related?
Yeah. Uh, I think a couple of things there. Everyone wants to talk about the reduction, but you don't know what you're reducing until you set a baseline, right? So having a good baseline and good data is probably understated because we just assume, especially within Hines and the access to capital and data that we have. But I think if you don't, the first thing to do is set a baseline. And Mesa does a great job of that using very inexpensive IoT devices to gather all that information, make it as automated as possible and not relying on human error, I'll call it. But then from there, it's really understanding what your business model is. To try to retrofit an existing building is sometimes difficult, but if you understand what your value is within the building, what the needs and wants are, and when you're going to implement capital already, that's what you need to leverage to its maximum. And assuming that the status quo is going to be profitable, I think is the other thing that people need to test their theory a little bit.
Yeah, and it does feel like we're in an interesting time where a lot of, at least what I think, a lot of the energy reduction and energy saving types of tools and equipment could
Yeah.
be capital intensive upfront, but also does have quite a big element of savings over time.
Yeah. I mean, if you just think about it, right? Heating is mainly the source that we want to decarbonize. Our buildings are already electrified with power, plug loads, and HVAC. So we need to get away from the heating side and moving that towards electrification, even domestic hot water. And if you look at it that simply, then it becomes a much easier problem to solve than trying to, deal with the entire building.
And you mentioned the real-time data aspect, which to put a plug in for Mesa does offer within your space as well. But I'm wondering if there's anything else you might want to highlight on what you've seen by using Mesa, which could be specific to, but also just in general, what types of elements of the product help that buildings could use in other places.
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and I haven't come to this conclusion until recently. And there's, three layers of data, and you probably can speak to this a lot better than I can. There's, and I'm going to get it wrong, but operational, tactical, and strategic. And really, you need the real-time energy data or real-time data in a building to leverage, operational decisions, tactical decisions, and strategic decisions. And I would say that the Mesa Center not only offers energy efficiency measures or highlights, but also what we're pushing on is the experiential side of it. How do we leverage all this data to create actionable measures within a building that aren't just energy? Because the investors, tenants, whatever other stakeholder is there, energy is very low priority on their sort of informational stack, or however you want to phrase it.
There's actually some great audience questions, so I'm going to sprinkle in a few additional questions here. So one question for you is I'll just read it directly, but basically, what is Hines doing to scale their ESG initiatives, and kind of what's the best bang for the buck, or what's the best way to move the needle in regards to sustainability goals?
Yeah, great question. We've formulated an entire team. It was announced just recently, maybe a month or two ago. Peter Epping will be leading that, but I'll be sliding into that team as well, and really to develop the whole strategy for the firm. And I think there's a couple of things we talked about here: setting a baseline, understanding where your faults are, and then leveraging opportunities. And I think it's also helpful. I think IDEO said this once, but having beacons of light and then building bridges. So build the structural framework within a building or within an organization so that you're able to make the default answer the one that you want and not make it difficult for someone to chase. So I think the best bang for your buck is reducing, it goes back to the graph, reducing the amount of waste heat within a building. And that comes down to, let's not use 3 or 4, maybe 2 or 3 different fossil fuel sources to generate the energy that we need in a building and don't connect them in any way, shape, or form. To me, that's a very linear, wasteful society. So if you start to, just like recycling or upcycling of trash, if you start to do that within buildings, energy recovery, heat pumps, and other things, you're moving heat around, you're reutilizing heat rather than, firing 1,000-degree boiler and only need 100-degree water coming out of it. Sorry if that was too broad and too technical at the same time.
I think that was great.
Yeah.
Let me go back to a couple other questions just related to, I guess, more so lessons that you have. So curious to hear from you. What would you say are one or two takeaways that you've seen or felt across the portfolio in relation to COVID or during COVID?
Yeah, I should make a plug for micro occupancy control, although we don't talk about it often. But COVID has seen that our buildings have been empty, but energy usage has been up, and I just think that speaks to that our buildings are not smart enough to adapt to the real-time changes within them. I always equate my house because my house is 10 times smarter than the office buildings that we're in from an energy and
Right.
interaction
Right.
perspective, right? And a lot of the IoT devices that you guys are using are very much off the shelf and easy to grab. And how do you collect all that data and organize it in a way? But my house can tell me if I'm there or not. It can tell me humidity. I have a heat pump to heat it. So it's everything that we dream of in an office building, but sometimes is difficult to implement and get across the finish line. For COVID, though, it's for me personally, it's been how much of an existential crisis COVID has been, but also climate change and how many people has affected it. I mean, it's brought us to our knees in a matter of days and kept us out of work for a year and a half. Very similar to the, Spanish flu in 1918. I don't know if we fared too much better or worse, to be honest. As a result of technology, we've been able to continue business, but if we didn't have technology, I think we would have been in the same place.
Right. Yeah. And sort of related to that and related to what you spoke about before, we have a good audience question here on your thoughts on how all of the stakeholders within a building or space can work together, particularly in existing buildings. So, tenants, owners, operators, landlords, especially because there's, for sure overlapping incentives, but slightly different ones.
Yeah, I think landlords do have a lot of the expertise. I mean, we have a lot of the knowledge, a lot of the data, and working together is key. Being open-minded as well. We come to the table quite often where we want to innovate, but the other person on the table may not want to. And I think just having a set of ground rules that everyone's on the same page that we need to tackle this together just opens up so many doors, so many more doors than if we just come at it as this is my side of the line and this is yours. And the truth is, that's the worst type of building to have where, the tenant installs their own control system, keeps their own data. We have no purview or insight because what we are is essentially an extension of the grid. All we're doing is delivering energy to our tenants. If we have no idea how they're utilizing that energy, then we're just sending really dumb, signals to it and just say, give it what we think it needs, not what it actually needs.
And do you have any tips or thoughts for all of us on returning to office? I think I always find it interesting. I love speaking to you about the kind of mix of how smart your home is versus how, not quite dumb, but how I would say how much control you lose in the office space. And I think people will really feel that gap between control and our cocooned home environments. And so I'm wondering what other thoughts you have on return to office.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think with IoT devices, it helps quite a bit because the cost has come down dramatically. So relying on these very large, I'll probably get yelled at, but inflexible systems at times, and really, sustainability shouldn't just be about the the environmental aspect of it. It's also about the financial aspect of it, right? How do we make it most efficient as possible in that three-tiered Venn diagram of environmental, financial, and social? I think returning to work, um, we've talked about this just previously on this call. I see the workspace as more collaborative. I was just in Europe for a conference, and there was a group of 10 people that came together, and some of us knew each other, some of us never met each other, some of us seen each other on Zoom, and to collaborate over the course of 3 days over a Zoom call would just been impossible. So our office space will be more, I'll call it inspiring and purpose driven and collaborative than it will be task oriented. But I don't know if that was the direction of the question, but
Yeah, no, I think that that's quite
you like
helpful.
anything I say, so should ask the
Um,
audience.
yeah, I mean, except for your fourth answer. No, just joking. Um, the and I think some of the other pieces in return to office is really thinking about across different building types how to make this space have that mix of comfort and comfort across things, like comfort in terms of collaborative, exciting, innovative, but also temperature comfort, high performance spaces, and um, and providing people the sense that their space is taken care of and that someone is noticing if things are out of place or not working, or anything on the on almost the air quality front. I think all of those things are interesting to think about across building types and office types, because those services, I believe, could be provided across building classes as well.
Absolutely.
Um, on that note, I'm wondering if there's any. We spoke a lot about, I think, the things people can do and the things that we can do across buildings. I'm wondering if you want to speak to any of the challenges or the harder things or the obstacles where, the almost like the less glossy picture.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I would not underestimate satisfying all the stakeholders, because I think the procurement process is the issue, really, making sure everyone's on board, down to the maintenance person within a building. And I wouldn't underestimate that, the leverage that people have, and people like to move in packs. They don't like to move out front, right? So you really need to get everyone across. So that would be my one takeaway. But really finding the sweet spot, and that's what it is. It's a sweet spot between the technical solution, the business model, and who's going to benefit. And once you start to find that sweet spot and move it around, become innovative in that space, that's when things get to get done more easily. And I wouldn't focus on just one solution. It really should be a whole, or one technology should be a whole solution that encompasses all these different technologies together that really make the sum greater than the whole, or the whole greater than the sum of the parts. Because it's very difficult for people to get on board with a single technology and then realize you're behind the wrong technology. But if you come up with a solution, it's like finance, right? They aggregate different risky products to make it less risky, just because you have more of them. And I think that's the case for building solutions as well. Don't just rely on one thing. Really understand what the grid is doing, where it will be heading, understand how you can plug into that, and so on and so forth, to come up with the best solution for your business model and for the value you're building.
I'm going to do one more question, and then we're going to move more into the audience questions, even though some have been sprinkled in. So thank you, everyone who's asked a question, and please feel free to ask more. The last question I want to ask you is, where do you think the future of commercial buildings is? Like, what would you say? I mean, both where do you think it's heading and where do you wish it was heading, in terms of, it could be across anything, not just energy related.
Yeah, I think it's really believing in the future again, in electrification and renewable energy. And if you look at that, you see the massive amounts of opportunity there. So making buildings prosumers, allowing them to drop load very quickly, just due to the inherent thermal storage within a building, I think is key. And being able to sell that on the electricity market. So you may say, well, how do you sell thermal energy on the electricity market? But that's essentially what it is at the end of the day, because we're taking electricity to create heating or cooling or move it around in a building. So I think there's a massive potential there for buildings to become prosumers and be adaptive to the environment that's inside them and not just static. And it's an on-off switch. I'm being overly facetious, but not just an on-off switch, but really adapt to the people, uh, their their work, their comfort level, and many other things within a building. And then getting down to this micro occupancy control that Mesa has, like my grandmother behind me shutting off the lights or setting back the air conditioning when it's not needed, or all the engineers out there making the lobby 60 degrees and freeze your what off when you walk in. So I think it's just making smarter decisions and more interactive.
Yeah, I mean, it is great to think of to think of where buildings can head, and especially where they can be headed given all of the smarts and technology that there is at more and more affordable prices. I think you can do so much more now. All right, I'm going to share a couple quick takeaways as we get more and more questions in. So thanks for adding questions, everyone. So a couple things to keep in mind, both consolidated from what Mike was saying, but also just in general from what Mike and I have learned over time is, one, you really have to understand the data. You have to know how much energy your building is consuming. You have to understand what is going on within the space. And there's a lot of, like I was saying, more and more solutions out there that can help both with the measuring and real-time data, getting a sense of where the low-hanging fruit is in your building in terms of what can you easily cut or reduce or set back, especially in ways that don't impact the occupants and more often than not can help make them more comfortable. And then getting a sense of who has control and how can that control be either shared or optimized will really matter. And then just, related to that, making sure that you're having the conversation with tenants, or if you are the tenant, having the conversation with the landlord on ways that you can work together to reduce wasted energy, which is both cost cutting and emissions reduction. And then, of course, plugging Mesa here, but considering ways that you can use Mesa or any affordable energy saving technology and cost cutting technology to be able to help get your building to where you want it to be. So I'm going to look at the questions coming in and ask a few to both to Mike, and I might help answer some of them. So Mike, there's been a few questions in terms of what Hines is doing in a little more detail. So questions around energy audits or energy recovery or any other thing related to some of the tactics that are being implemented at Hines. Do you want to speak to some of those?
Yeah,
in whatever detail you're allowed to.
Yeah, no problem. We're definitely doing energy audits. That's pretty much a standard. I would also say there's a question about energy recovery. And I can't speak specifically for every Hines project and nor in Hudson Square, but I don't see energy recovery on the ventilation side as an issue. I mean, if you look at hospitals, they do it all the time and they have very noxious and contaminant materials. So it's just a matter of not contaminating the air streams. And there's companies out there which will actually reduce the amount of CO2 coming into the building by scrubbing it. I'm not suggesting that at this point, but I think the amount of energy that we can keep within the building without reducing outside air is key. And then moving heat around the building through the use of heat pumps from where heat is to where heat is needed is the easiest thing we can do and piggybacks on the state's aggressive climate goals and their financial investment in renewable energy within the state. So if I were to look at the 20-year horizon, I would say that natural gas is on its way out and clean electricity is on its way in. Just to be quite frank about it, electrical machines are 2 to 3 times more efficient than their fossil fuel counterpart, right? And we've been working with fossil fuel equipment for for decades, if not centuries. And I really think they've hit a plateau of efficiency as well as acceptance within the market, whereas renewable energy is on the opposite swing.
Thanks, Mike. I'm gonna take a couple around Mesa to give you a bit of a break.
Off the hook.
So a few questions on Mesa. So one question around Mesa. I think the heart of the question is what does Mesa do? This question says Mesa seems to be identifying issues. How long does it take building operators to act or correct those? And does Mesa give any insight on how power from the grid is impacting the loads in the building? There's other Mesa related questions on how does Mesa address the impact of anticipated future climate data and building energy use and targets. So let me speak to both of those. One is, for the most part, Mesa is automating the actions. So for example, in spaces where there's occupancy detection and these comfort buttons to understand how comfortable people are within the space. Are they too hot? Are they too cold? Is it the right temperature within that space? So those are a couple of examples of just the types of data that Mesa would collect. And then within that information, in terms of understanding the sense of occupancy patterns, and it's just motion detection, it's not people counting or not video or anything like that. It just detects if there's motions, humans or even animals within a space, and then determines what zones are being used, what's the current temperature and what's the future temperature. So it would take all of that information and then adjust the heating or cooling temperatures to ensure that you're not overcooling or overheating spaces if people are too cold or too hot, or if there's no one in the space. And so a lot of the actions that happen are just being adjusted and taken into account in terms of the temperature that's set within the space, or even shared plug loads. So for example, those conference room monitors that are always left on, they don't need to be left on when no one's in the office space or in that area. So all of that action is automated. In terms of understanding the energy use and the power consumed and all of the questions around that, Mesa does take into account kind of like time of day, price per time of day for that energy, and also a rough sense of the emissions for the energy source being used at that time. And so it will try to modify energy use based on that information. And it also, actually in the next couple months, you'll be able to see that live on the dashboard as well, on the Mesa dashboard. I think we're actually almost at time for 1:45 Eastern. I'm just seeing if there's any other last minute questions coming in. But the other thing I wanted to add kind of at the end, which can just be a go-to source for everyone, is we keep this page at Sidewalk Labs updated with local law 97 information. And we also keep it updated with some other other cities regulation. So feel free to come to this page anytime. Feel free to contact Shayna, our growth lead on the team, this email address, Mesa@Sidewalk Labs. I see as well. I think Mike was saying we also have single letter email addresses. My email is just r@sidewalklabs.com. If you have any questions about Mesa or anything about what we're doing and working on with Hines, please feel free to reach out. Thanks so much, everyone, for attending.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Mike. It's always great to chat with you.
Same
formally
here.
or informally, on video or not on video.
Yeah, exactly.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a good day.